Good afternoon, everyone. You're now tuned into A Reasonable Conversation on Nusound Radio 92 FM. I'm Prerna and I'll be with you till 1 p.m. Hope everyone's having a great Mother's Day. And today in the studio, I'm very pleased to have Jo Sidhu QC back with us. Jo is a top criminal QC in the country at 25 Bedford Row. He was brought up in Southall and has been chair of the school governing body for 17 years. In addition to that, he's also been a counsellor in Ealing. He studied politics, philosophy and economics at Oxford University. He's the vice chair of the Equality and Diversity Committee at the Bar Council and also the chair of the Society of Asian Lawyers. If anyone would like to speak to us on air, the studio number is 0208 472 9292. If you want to text us, the text line is 07961 387 787. And you can also tweet us at nusound92fm or write to us on our Facebook page. Hi Jo, welcome to the show.
Good afternoon, Prerna. It's great to be back on.
Many thanks for being here. Hope you're having a great weekend.
Well, it's a beautiful weekend. The weather's looking really fine, and it's a happy Mother's Day out there, and a happy Mother's Day to my mum, who may be listening now, I think.
Oh, thanks. Happy Mother's Day to my mum too. I might as well do the same. Right, today we're going to be talking about a very important topic. I mean, it's been featuring in the press a lot, especially this week, and that's illegal aid cuts. The Ministry of Justice has announced that they're going to be suspending some cuts, and that's going to be after the next general election. They were going to bring in some cuts, I think, pretty soonish, but barristers have been threatening action. They did strike before and they were due to strike again. Now, for our listeners, why is legal aid so important? Why are barristers striking about legal aid? I mean, what's going on?
Well, in fact, Prerna, the legal aid issue, which has taken up quite a bit of print space in the newspapers and on television, most recently because of the fact that barristers took a very, very unusual step and historically have never done this before, which is that they went on what could only be described as a strike, and they've done that twice now. The first time was on the 6th of January for half a day, and the second time more recently on the 7th of March for a full day. And this is, of course, a very, very important development because legal aid has played a crucial role in ensuring that the public get access to the justice system, whether it's the criminal justice system, whether it's family law or any of the other areas of work in which solicitors and barristers together represent clients who come out from our communities. And so it's really important to understand what has been going on in the last few years. This isn't something which popped up just in 2014 or in 2013. For very many years, there has been a real terms cut in the provision of legal aid to those lawyers who work in these areas. And we need to pause and think about that. The public may have many views about lawyers, and lawyers aren't always necessarily the most sympathetic group of people in society. Americans make jokes about lawyers.
I can imagine. They're called liars instead of lawyers.
They are sometimes, and these are deeply unfair ways of describing lawyers. I mean, you yourself, having studied law and you were qualified as a barrister, and you know that I've been a barrister for the last 21 years. Those of us who work very hard within the system to represent our clients, we want the public to understand the sort of work that we do and how hard we try to make sure that they are properly represented. So we have a situation now where solicitors and barristers have been effectively under attack for very many years. Unlike other groups of workers within our society, like nurses or firefighters or other people that the public naturally feels sympathy with, lawyers have had real difficulty in getting their message across, and the government undoubtedly have taken full advantage of this in painting lawyers in the most negative way possible.
Just to clarify, so are barristers and solicitors affected by these legal aid cuts?
Very much.
I know the barristers have been on strike before. Have the solicitors... Have they taken similar action, or are they going to be taking similar action?
Yes, solicitors themselves have been taking action on this. Solicitors are very unhappy with what is going on because the vast majority of solicitors in this country do publicly funded work. And the vast majority of barristers in this country do publicly funded work. And when I say publicly funded, I'm talking about legal aid work.
Okay.
So legal aid as a resource available to society, which is administered through the government, the Ministry of Justice, is an absolutely vital means by which the public can ensure that when they have difficulty, when they are in trouble, when they need help, they can get a lawyer to represent them. In the first instance, they will go to a solicitor, and then thereafter, if the matter requires the involvement of a specialist barrister, then the solicitor will instruct a barrister. So solicitors and barristers who work within legal aid are doing so not because they love money, because real money as a lawyer is not made by doing legal aid work. Real money is made by those solicitors and barristers who do commercial work, who do other kinds of work which involve representing private clients and corporate clients. The solicitors and barristers who work within legal aid funding are, generally speaking, people who have a very strong sense of public service and public duty.
You mentioned, what kind of areas is this in? Because, the commercial work is not publicly funding, so that's where all the money is.
Yes.
So where are, what areas of law are publicly funded predominantly?
We think of areas like the criminal justice system.
Okay.
Think of family work. So think of people, for example, who are vulnerable in families, women who need the support of a lawyer if they're going through a difficult divorce or they have problems at home with a violent husband, who need to ensure that their children are protected and protected by the courts. All of these people need help, they need to be supported, and they don't necessarily have the money to fund their own representation. Think of people who may be applying to come into this country because they are the victims of oppression abroad and they are asylum applicants. We all know, of course, not all asylum applicants are necessarily genuine, but there are people out there who genuinely are fleeing from problems in other countries across the world. Think about other people who are in employment who may have difficulty getting representation if they can't get support from legal aid. So there are many, many areas of work within the law which potentially members of the public can be the beneficiary of legal aid for. And think of it this way, Prerna, when we talk about the National Health Service, no one argues about people having universal access.
Definitely.
No one says that, look, if you're not very well off, if you're poor, you should get a worse service than someone who has more money. No one says that only rich people's children should get educated within our system of education. We know that we have universal education available to all. The people who work within the law also regard legal aid as something which is essential. Even this government, which has been trying very hard to cut legal aid over the last number of years, has to accept that it is important that legal aid is available to the public, because if it wasn't, then there would be millions of people in the UK who simply wouldn't be able to find representation. So to understand what's going on, what our listeners really could appreciate is that there are many, many lawyers, particularly from the minority communities, who have been working very hard to try and protect themselves from these legal aid cuts so that they can continue to provide a service to their communities. I personally, over the last 21 years, have been working almost overwhelmingly within the publicly funded sector of law. So my own work has been legally aided, and there are many clients that I've represented over the last 2 or so decades who I know wouldn't have been able to get a good lawyer if legal aid wasn't available. And I'm afraid what's going to happen now is that if the government continues to talk in terms of millions, tens of millions, £220 million, in fact, of cuts, we're going to end up in a situation where members of the public simply will not be able to find a lawyer on their high street who is available to do work for them, because those lawyers will go out of business.
Okay, we've had a couple of texts come in. Ashok has texted in saying, is legal aid available to people who are not citizens of this country? So anyone who's in the UK but not citizens of the UK, are they able to access legal aid if they fall into difficulties or have problems?
Well, being a citizen of this country isn't a prerequisite to getting legal aid, just as being a citizen of this country is not a prerequisite to getting an education or getting access to the National Health Service at your local hospital or local GP centre. The test for legal aid is set out on an application form. There is no question, and the public need to understand this, there's no question of people being able to simply get legal aid on the nod. They have to go through a process of applying for legal aid and having an approved solicitor to represent them when they get into difficulty, whether it's because of a family problem, a marriage problem, children, criminal justice system, or whatever else it happens to be. It's something which needs to be established beforehand that they are entitled to legal aid, and then when they're entitled to legal aid, then they will be represented.
Right, we've got another text message from Ranjit. This country is the only one in Europe who have a large budget for legal aid. Surely that money could be spent wisely. So I know all the public sectors in the UK are taking cuts right now because of austerity and all these various measures that are being implemented to improve the economy. Could the bar be, or, you know, the legal profession in general be taking these cuts and making savings elsewhere?
Well, there's 2 points there, and they're both equally valid points, I think. The first question is the way in which it's been represented by the government as to the amount of money that this country spends on its legal aid budget. There's been a great deal of misinformation about that. The government has tried to make it sound as though our legal aid system is so incredibly expensive compared to other countries that it really needs to be cut back quite severely. The figures that the government have produced have never been properly substantiated. The way that they go about it is simply to cast some sort of a slur on legal aid lawyers and say, well, you're consuming more money than your equivalent lawyers are consuming elsewhere. Now, there are a number of factors here which I could go into, but the really important point is this, that the legal aid budget is very stringently controlled by this government. Okay. We're living in an age of austerity where every penny has to be justified, and the government keeps a very close and beady eye on what is being spent. So there's no question of the government simply allowing people to be using legal aid or consuming legal aid without any sort of limit or cap. It is all strictly controlled. The second point, which is a valid point, as I say, which has been raised, is can there be efficiencies brought into the system, whether it's the criminal justice system or the administration of family legal work, which could make the system work with the same output but at a lower cost? And the answer is, of course, there is. And the Bar and the Law Society, who represent solicitors, have offered the government a number of ideas and proposals for how we can improve efficiencies within the system. But this government simply hasn't been interested in that. The government has been hell-bent on cutting the legal aid budget. The government itself knows that the things that they have done within the system to try and cut costs have in fact backfired. I'll give you two simple examples, Prerna. A lot of people in the public know that the security services which have been administering the looking after of prisoners, either at court or at prison, in prisons, have been operating incredibly inefficiently, firms like G4S. And the government has, in fact, licensed these companies to do work. And those companies, in fact, have been consuming huge amounts of public funds. And the same applies also with interpreters, where the government has tried to introduce privatization, ostensibly to make the system better. But in fact, what it's done is made the system more inefficient. And there are thousands of lawyers who will tell you, and judges who will tell you, how inefficient the system has become.
We've actually got a solicitor on the phone at the moment, Gems from Cocker & Co Solicitors. Hi, Gems.
How are you, Prerna? I thought I'd ring in and just mirror what our Jo Sidhu is saying. Effectively, I'm going to pose this question, actually. Now, as we well know, the legal aid cuts and the budgets have been reduced drastically. Not only that, that effectively means that defendants and so forth are now having to pay privately. But there's a cut in that element of things as well. Now, as you well know, Mr. Sandu, there's the... if I were to win a case in the Crown Court, it doesn't automatically mean that my legal aid costs are paid by the public purse. That's correct, isn't it?
Yeah, you were talking about contributions, Germs, yeah?
Well, not contributions, taking away legal aid in its entirety. Say if I instructed someone completely on a private basis, because my...
Yes, on a private basis, absolutely, Germs. The law's been changed, as you know. The Act was what's called LASPO. And from the 1st of October of 2012, any cases that went to the Crown Court that were committed after that date, it meant that even if you paid privately as a defendant who was, let's say, an innocent defendant who won their case, who established their innocence before a Crown Court jury, and had spent thousands of pounds in getting representation for themselves to a solicitor and a barrister to look after them, and they had proved that they were innocent, effectively, would not get their money back, and that seems completely unacceptable.
But it runs against the grain of what of general justice, do you not think, in terms of I'm a completely innocent party, I choose not to take the legal aid contribution, and because of my choice, I'm damned when I'm acquitted.
Quite right. And Germs, you know as well that because the government is trying to force more and more members of the public out of legal aid, so they've now established a cut-off point. So if your household income is more than £37,000, the whole household income is more than £37,000, you fall off a cliff, which means that you won't get legal aid. Now, how many people do you know, Germs, whose combined income in their household is more than £37,000? Quite a few people fall into that bracket. So what that means, Germs, as you know, is that person is going to end up being forced to pay privately for their representation. Imagine if that person is actually innocent, that they've been falsely accused, and they win their case in the Crown Court, and they can't get any of their legal costs back. So they've gone through the...
encouraging people to, opt for legal aid. so they can get it back?
Well, if they're entitled to it, Prerna.
Wow.
Of course, if they're not entitled, they won't get it.
They have to fit into the very narrow boxes that the Legal Aid Commission are now forcing them into. But it's just a travesty of justice in some respects.
Well, it is. I mean, because Germs, you know, and because you are a solicitor and you spend your entire career representing ordinary people. You're not dealing with, wealthy, high net worth individuals who will go to big city firms and have limitless amounts of money. You're dealing with community people who need to be looked after when they get themselves into difficulty. And when ordinary, hard-working people who have families that have income that exceeds £37,000 find that they are not entitled to legal aid, are falsely accused, go to court, find themselves acquitted by 12 men and women in a jury who know that they are innocent and say that they are innocent, and then to find that they have a huge legal cost bill that they have to foot, and the government won't pay for it because the government says, well, sorry, it's all very unfortunate that you've gone through the stress of a trial and being prosecuted when in fact you were innocent all along, but we're not going to pay the money back that you had to fork out for your representation because that's just tough luck. Well, Gums, you'll understand, as a fellow lawyer who does the sort of work that I do, looking after ordinary members of the public, that there is something which is deeply disingenuous about this. If the government is really serious about forcing more and more members of the public to pay for their own representation, then the least the government can do is make sure that when those people who have to represent themselves through privately funded lawyers get themselves acquitted, are found innocent, they should at least have their costs reimbursed by the state. But at the moment, that is not the case, and that is deeply unfair.
I can give you umpteen examples of clients of mine who are first generation, now second generation migrants who've come into the country now, doing very well for themselves, albeit their standard of English is still not great. Whilst they're earning above the threshold, they win their case because they need someone to represent them, because they cannot represent themselves because of their lack of understanding of the legal process. And perhaps, to put it as blatantly as I do, in terms of their English, they cannot represent themselves in terms of the English language. They come to me and they say, well, Mr. Sain, I'd like you to represent us. And we have to give them the spiel at the very beginning to say, well, look, if you would like me to represent you, you will not get your costs back, even if you're acquitted. And they look at me as if I'm either ripping them off, or alternatively saying, well, I'll try and represent myself. But of course, if they represent themselves, they're not giving themselves a fighting chance. As you well know, the system is, it's not for you to prove your innocence, it's for the prosecution to prove their case and to test the case. If you're not a lawyer, how on earth are you going to do that? That's the travesty of justice I see. Now, I also see on the private element of things, which is stemming from the legal aid cuts itself, is the fact that people come in and they will start the process, and there'll be interpreters who will mess the system up. The case gets adjourned, and they're still carrying the burden of the brief fee. For those listeners that don't know what a brief fee is, it is basically a barrister who's taken the time out to prepare the case, taken the time out of his diary, and hasn't accepted another case because they're dealing with one case. They still want to be paid for it naturally. And then when you get it adjourned for the next occasion, with no fault of their own, you can go for a wasted cost argument, but which falls on deaf ears before the courts nowadays. They're left with a massive bill, and they look to us and say, we cannot afford to take this matter forward. As a solicitor at the front of the queue, it puts us in a very difficult position. Do we try and instill justice in the system and take a deferred payment towards the end and hope that we get our money, or do you let the client go and say, sorry, I have bills to pay?
So what tends to happen in your experience? Because that sounds really unfair that a barrister can spend all this time in preparation for a case and then not get paid for it.
Well, naturally, we're fortunate enough that we have barristers like Mr. Sidhu that we do, that perhaps say, okay, well, I can take a view in terms of I will reduce it to X, Y, or Z. But the system, you're bound by a system whereby someone is entitled to payment, but you can't offer it because the client wants that money to take their case forward in the future, and if they can't spend the money twice. But the travesty of justice here, Prerna, is the fact that even if the person was acquitted at the end and they go on a full privately paying basis, they're not entitled to their costs. And how this links into legal aid is you're damned if you take legal aid, if you are fortunate enough to receive it, and you're damned if you don't, because if you're acquitted, you're going to be left with a £60,000 bill, which you're going to be paying off for the next 3 years. I once had a client say to me, well, I might as well go to prison for 3 years.
No.
And we said, well, look, that simply cannot happen. And he was, ultimately, he's still paying his legal fees to this day.
That's terrible.
Completely false allegation that was made against him.
Gums, can I ask you a question? Where is your firm located?
We're based in the heart of Ilford, right opposite the station.
And this is a really important point, because you mentioned the issue of interpreters, you mentioned the issue of being able to represent people from your local community. I want the listeners to understand how serious the situation is. About 5 years ago, there were 4,000 firms of solicitors who were entitled to offer legal assistance in the criminal justice system. And in London, about 40% of those 4,000 solicitors were owned or controlled by Asian or black lawyers. Over the last 4 years, that number, 4,000 firms, has been absolutely shredded down to about 1,600 firms. This government is now threatening to reduce that 1,600 number of firms down to about 525.
So
and it is, and you can see what the pattern is, Gurms. What's happening here, for those of us particularly who have made it a priority to try and help communities in areas like London and, of course, across the country, where communities who have difficulty looking after themselves when they enter into the criminal justice system, whether it's because of language problems or otherwise, those communities desperately need lawyers like us to look after them. Otherwise, they're going to find that they're going to be looked after by lawyers who really have nothing in common with them. One of the big priorities for both the solicitor's profession and for the barrister's profession has been to improve diversity within our ranks. We've made it a big priority to ensure that as many minority lawyers have the opportunity to enter the bar, because as you know, Gurms, if you go back 30, 40 years, both the solicitor's profession and the barrister's profession was almost entirely white. But it's changed radically, and all the progress that we have made over these last number of years is about to be undone. I'll tell you why, because I think, Gurms, you know, but the listeners ought to understand as well. If you price all of these firms out of the market, remembering that most minority firms are concentrated in publicly funded work, the result of that will be there will be so many fewer firms available in this country and in big cities like London that members of the ethnic minorities that live in these areas will find that they'll have to travel long distances to go and find a representative. And when they find a representative, invariably they will feel that that representative simply doesn't understand their problems from their perspective. So all the hard work that we've done will be simply ripped up. And the other point as well, Gurms, I think you recognise, I sense that you've been in the business of providing legal services for a number of years, as have I. You will be concerned, as I am concerned, that at the bottom end of our respective professions, the solicitor's profession and the bar, that we are able to encourage young minority lawyers to feel that they can enter our ranks and do something useful in terms of their career, as we've tried to do. But at the moment, what's happening is that the number of, for example, pupilages, which is like an apprenticeship, as you know, Gurms, for the bar, and the number of training contracts for solicitor firms is drying up. And it's drying up because your firms and our chambers, which work within the bar, simply cannot afford anymore to take on trainees. And if we don't take on trainees, I'm afraid the only people who will be able to afford to come into our professions are those who have parents with bottomless pockets and who can afford to send their kids into the law. And that is not what we are trying to achieve, because in the long term, if we want more women to come into the profession, more minorities to come into the profession, and have true diversity so that our judges of the future properly represent the communities that they are judging when they have of cases come before them. If you want that, you've got to make sure that you keep our professions alive and thriving. And if you take away the very means by which those professions survive, by cutting legal aid in the savage way that this government is doing, you're going to end up with a legal profession that has more in common with the 1950s than it does with 2014.
Well, the system itself, just leading on from that point, is suggesting to everybody that we are trying to diversify. We're trying to do this. Now, we have to complete a diversity questionnaire on an annual basis. Now, with the Law Society, they're showing one thing, but the object, the motivation is quite different. To say, well, if we reduce legal aid, if we make it only available for competitive tendering with the bigger firms, obviously the smaller firms, the firms that offer that niche service, the niche service insofar as they can speak the second language and so on and so forth, are no longer going to be there.
And have you experienced this?
Exactly correct in terms of when people come to me and say, well, I'd like to pursue a career in the legal profession, the first thing I say is, well, think about it, because not only are you going to be spending £10,000 per year for your tuition fees, but then you have the training contract or the I think it's the BVC.
BPTC.
Yeah, absolutely, for barristers to fund, and then that is on the hope. And I say hope on an emphasised basis that you will get a pupillage or you will get a training contract. Now, I'm sure Chambers will agree. We have there'll be many applicants for pupillages, very able applicants for pupillage, but you simply cannot offer them to everybody.
And in fact, we've had to cut across the barrister's profession, and I know this isn't welcome news for those listeners who are thinking about qualifying as a lawyer, perhaps even becoming a barrister. Those people who have that aspiration will not be pleased to hear that the number of pupillages have contracted by a quarter over the last couple of years. And that is a huge reduction, because I can tell you, for example, in my own chambers, which is a leading criminal defence set, 25 Bedford Row, we've had to cut the number of pupillages. And the reality of it is, I'm afraid, is that when legal aid begins to be cut in the way that it is and has been for many years, the onward consequence for our chambers and other chambers is they can't offer as many traineeships as they used to. And what does that mean? That means that young people who have this burning ambition to one day be a lawyer, maybe one day go into a Crown Court, wear a wig and a gown and be able to represent people in the great tradition, particularly of the Asian community for many years, with leaders like Mahatma Gandhi, Jawaharlal Nehru, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, all these great leaders who qualified at the bar of England and Wales and went back to their countries to secure independence. There are many young people who see that as a role model, and they'll never be able to make that a reality if these legal aid cuts come in, because they'll never be able to get a traineeship. And I'm afraid that's a very backward step. I mean, Prerna, let's if I may just ask Prerna a couple of questions, because Prerna herself, listeners may or may not know, has had a legal background. She qualified on the bar training course, which means that she has now completed the vocational qualification stage of becoming a barrister. And I hope very much that Prerna decides one day that she wants to enter the ranks of the bar, because no doubt that's what she hoped to do as well. But Prerna, as a younger person who has that aspiration, are you filled with confidence at the moment that the future for someone like you is going to be promising and give you a chance to make your own place?
Well, especially with the bar, not at all. I mean, lots of chambers are actually deferring taking pupils on this year, and they have been last year as well. There's always been this problem that with the legal aid cuts, like you said, it's going to trickle down to the lower end of the bar, and people just aren't recruiting anymore. And when I do speak to people about becoming a practicing barrister, joining different chambers, they're like, well, we can't take anyone on, especially with the criminal bar. I mean, criminal law isn't what I want to go into, but I do know the criminal bar and the family bar in particular, they're just not taking pupils on. And
Prerna, have you had a chance to talk to many friends of yours who are practicing solicitors, working in legal aid work, who are suffering very badly at the moment, trying to make ends meet in their offices? Because if they go out of business, then there's even less work that's going to come through to the bar. So as a referral profession, you know that the bar only survives if solicitors are able to themselves make a living. And all of these lawyers, solicitors and barristers are struggling, particularly the junior barristers and the junior solicitors are on very low incomes. And we need to get this message across. whatever the government says about fat cat lawyers, of course the government will say whatever it takes in order to get their agenda across. They will disparage barristers and disparage solicitors as much as they can in order to get the public behind them, even if that means saying things which are simply not true.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think there's a perception there that barristers and lawyers, barristers and solicitors, where they're really rich, they have lots of money. But actually, the truth is, it's not like that at all. I know pupils who are struggling to pay bills. They're still waiting for payments to be made to them for 3 months ago.
Absolutely.
The system's very, very slow. I'm sure you both know that as well. It does take a very long time for someone to get paid if they're on legally funded work.
It's terrible. I mean, from what I understand, I have chambers that ring constantly when we're paying on a private basis to say, well, look, could you help us out a little bit and ensure that the bill is going to be paid on time, simply because the LSC have got this particular council's or this particular...
So just for our listeners, what is the LSC?
LSC is the Legal Services Commission. Correct me if I'm wrong. It hasn't changed the name, has it?
It's called the Legal Aid Agency now.
Well, there you go. It changes so often. It's incredible. But they are the people who control the legal aid and pay barristers and solicitors. You have to submit your bills, and from what I understand, even if there's a minute mistake in the bill, they will send it back and put you out the back of the queue again. It's just an absolute farce. Now, what barristers and solicitors in the criminal fraternity are now doing is taking the challenge up, and I wouldn't say disrupting the court system, but making a stand and saying, well, we're not going to accept return briefs, and I'm sure Mr. Sidhu will explain what a return brief is, or we're not going to attend on a given day, simply because it is not fair that we are earning, or we are doing a good day's work and earning almost equivalent to the national minimum wage. I mean, I have solicitors on a fixed fee that they have to represent a client, even be it to trial, for less than £300-400.
Wow, that's shocking. Germs, we're going to take a quick commercial break. Thank you very much for phoning in, and thank you for telling our listeners about, what you've been facing as a solicitor. Thank you very much.
Pleasure. You take care now, mate.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
We're just going to take a quick commercial break. Keep your texts coming in on 07961 387 787. The text lines are jam-packed, but we're going to try and get everything in.
Advertise on nusound Radio for as little as £10 per day. For further details, telephone 020 8 472 9994.
Welcome back to a reasonable conversation on nusound Radio 92 FM. I'm joined in the studio with Jo Sidhu QC, and we've been speaking about the legal aid cuts. We've just got a caller on air, Patrick Maddens, the Sub-Treasurer of the Inner Temple. Hi Patrick, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you, and good to be with you again.
Excellent, many thanks for joining us.
I'm joining you from the Inner Temple itself.
Are you? Oh, excellent, to make it even more special. We've been talking about the legal aid cuts before the break. Has the legal aid cuts been affecting the bar in your perception? I mean, has the Inner Temple noticed that barristers' chambers are facing difficulties in these times?
Well, people need to know that the cuts to legal aid come in one of two forms. The first is that there were areas of legal advice where any citizen used to be eligible for legal aid, and now they can't. It's just not available to you.
Okay.
The other one is, where is it still available to you? The fees that the barristers are given by the state to represent you have been very substantially cut. And of course, it's the latter one that affects the barristers, although just about every barrister I've met is more concerned, not for themselves, but for all those people who just can't get any legal aid at any price at all.
Definitely. I mean, what can these people do? I mean, if they can't have access to legal aid, are they all going to become litigants in person?
Well, most of it falls on, obviously, people who are not so well off financially, and also very vulnerable, because the biggest areas where legal aid has been removed has been in a whole range of family law matters, and these are very difficult and often traumatic circumstances. It could be a contested will, it could be a divorce, it could be the custody of children, a whole range of things. It could be an eviction from your house, and now you're no longer entitled to legal aid. So what can you do? Well, there are some charities who can assist you a little bit, and many barristers work for those charities. They're called legal aid centres.
Okay.
But the other thing that is happening, of course, is that many people have no alternative but to represent themselves in the court, And of course, this is very difficult because people generally don't know how courts work.
I can imagine. I mean, Lord Neuberger in an interview said that more litigants in person will waste court time and be more expensive. So actually, these legal aid cuts, which will, make the system more efficient, will actually, work to his disadvantage.
That has been a point, and we're not just talking about courts at first instance, but sometimes all the way up to the Court of Appeal, where we now find litigants in person representing themselves. I should say that the courts and the judges are very sympathetic to litigants in person and will try and help them in every way they can. There are sometimes volunteers that will help you, and the Bar Council has a very, very good guide, free guide, as to how you can be a litigant in person. But it's difficult because you won't know the law, and you won't know how the court procedures work. And so therefore, yes, court cases with litigants in person take very, very much longer than if you were being represented by a barrister.
Joe, what do you think about what Patrick's just said?
Well, Patrick, I can echo many of the things that you've just said about the issues where you have people who cannot get representation having to go to court on their own, that judges will be sympathetic and understanding. But Patrick, you yourself will know from your work within a temple and dealing with judges and magistrates around the country that it is extremely difficult for tribunals to deal with litigants in person. And in fact, it causes not just disruption sometimes to proceedings for no fault of their own, because these litigants have a very limited knowledge of the law and procedure, but it means that these hearings get extended sometimes unnecessarily. So if the effect of these legal aid cuts is to force more and more people to have to represent themselves, the result of all of that will be that the administration of justice will take even longer than it already does. And that cannot be good, because that will add to the costs of the system. So here we are, all of us in agreement, Patrick, myself, Prerna, and all the others, including Germs, who rang in earlier, that we want to preserve a system which is fair and equitable, a system which allows members of the public to be able to access the justice system and to have representation when they need it. And we're all in agreement that, in fact, if we don't have that sort of a system in the future, we are heading for a crisis, because the courts will then get clogged up with lots of people who are having to look after themselves because they can't afford a lawyer. And that can't be good for the system of justice, and it can't be good for those individuals. And we have to look at this in the round. I mean, we have a major problem. I think Patrick himself would observe that there are issues of funding within the system that have to be addressed. The question is how you address them. It's about priorities. It's about what's important to our society as an advanced society that prides itself on having one of the best systems of justice in the entire world. We believe, in fact, I'm sure Patrick would agree, that we have the best system in the entire world. And that system only works if you have individuals within it who are prepared to contribute, and contribute in a fair way, and be paid fairly for the work that they do. That's the lawyers, the judges, the court staff, all the people who are involved in the training programs to make our next generation of lawyers ready to enter the ranks of the profession. If we don't do those things, I'm afraid, I'm sure you'll agree, Patrick, we are at risk of taking steps backward and find ourselves in a situation where we're no longer the leading system in the world. We then become just another system like any other.
Patrick, do you think there is a risk of that, as Joe just said, that, with these legal aid cuts, our system can deteriorate?
I think there's a very real risk, and it comes in two ways. And first of all, we just believe that everyone should have access to justice. It shouldn't just be for the rich. And that's what legal aid is designed to do, is to fund people's legal access when they don't have the funds to do it themselves. But the other thing that's going to happen is going to stop some of our brightest and best becoming lawyers and barristers. And that, I think, is very, very regrettable too. The solicitors and the barristers have made great strides. You're one of them, Prerna.
Thank you.
To increase a much wider range of people coming to become lawyers. And there's been some success in that over the last 10 years. And I think all of that's going to be at jeopardy, because, a lot of people become barristers. Actually, they want to be fairly paid, yes, of course, but they're not doing it to become, really fat cat lawyers. They're doing it because they're passionate about justice and the rule of law and representing people. Can I make another point, if I may?
Yeah, please do.
I'd like to have your attention on litigants in person. that I've been told about now on several occasions. And that is one of the great advantages of having a barrister representing you, is particularly the case when English is not your first language. And you have, therefore, you might have a competent level of English, but it's not your first language. And therefore, you have a barrister who is far more able to articulate on your behalf what you're feeling and thinking. And one of the difficulties for a number of litigants in person is actually that they just don't feel comfortable at this very high level of using the English language properly. And that can't be fair or right either.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, Jo did mention earlier that the system could be improved with relation to interpreters and people whose first language isn't English. That, cuts can be made because interpreters themselves actually do abuse the system.
And I think also, Prerna, Patrick makes a very valid point, the diversity point, which Patrick is alluding to, that a lot of hard work, Prerna, I sit as the Vice Chair of Equality and Diversity in the Bar Council, and I chair the Society of Asian Lawyers, which has been at the forefront of this campaign to prevent these legal aid cuts decimating communities, particularly minority communities. And want to mention that Prerna has now recently come on to the Society of Asian Lawyers Committee itself, and I've no doubt will be making her own contribution over the next year. And Patrick, the key point here, of course, is that diversity does matter. It is important to ensure that people who are coming into our profession, whether it's the bar or it's a solicitor's profession, are not prevented from doing so because they happen to come from a different background to that which most people associate with barristers and solicitors. That's a white middle-class background. We now have, and I'm sure, Patrick, you've seen it yourself within the Inner Temple, a very large number of young men and women of every colour coming into the profession who have great hopes that one day they'll be able to make their mark and serve their communities. And if they can't afford to do so because legal aid is cut and they simply can't get a place for a traineeship, a pupillage or a training contract, or they can't make a practice work because even though they get to a certain position, they simply can't continue to function because solicitors are drying up and they can't give more work, that means that we're going to end up with a demographic in the bar and in the solicitor's profession which is something that resembles times gone past. And we don't want that because we're looking to see that the future judges that are responsible for some of the most important decisions in our society properly reflect the communities from which they are drawn. And what these threats of legal aid cuts mean is that the government, in fact, is going to push us backwards. And I'm very concerned about that. I think all of us are very concerned about that. And listeners ought to be concerned because even if a listener right now has never had any reason to need legal aid, it may be that in the future they or a member of their family or a friend will find themselves in difficulty or trouble and they will need legal aid, and then it will become an immediate concern to them.
Patrick, just going to the diversity issue, are you finding at the Inner Temple that there are students from diverse backgrounds who are facing difficulties, or that those students that get pupillage are from, non-Asian backgrounds?
Well, I think we're just on the cusp of it, because until a couple of years ago there was a reasonable prospect that if you decided to do what we call publicly funded work, that is predominantly in the criminal courts and the family courts funded by legal aid, that you would. You wouldn't be a millionaire, but you would be reasonably remunerated. But as I mentioned earlier on, where the legal aid is still available, the rates that are being paid to barristers, and there's some argument about the exact level of the cuts, that they have been cut substantially. And it's interesting, the director, and I found this rather amusing, the director of the Office of National Statistics recently had to correct the Ministry of Justice, who was saying, oh, come on, it's not that so bad, barristers are earning quite a decent amount. No, they're not.
Yeah.
And the director had to correct the Minister of Justice. Can I say one other thing? I mean, we do live in a democracy, and we have an elected government, and we have, for the last 5 years, been in a recession.
Yeah.
And we have a government that's decided that its economic response is going to be to cut public expenditure everywhere, not just in justice, but all of the ministries. And of course, many people try and make pleadings that they are special cases. What the barristers and the solicitors have consistently done in their negotiations with the Ministry of Justice over these cuts is to say, we understand that you're no different to any other government department, You've got to cut your expenditure. But here are alternative ways of doing it. We've really engaged with the Ministry of Justice. And I would just remind people that the contracts that the Ministry of Justice have recently let for things such as taking prisoners from prisons to courts, the National Translation Service, the checking service, these have been so appallingly run that in one case the supplier is actually being prosecuted for fraud. So,
oh wow, that's terrible.
So the government, if the government sort of completely sort of tidied up its own procurement processes, we would have saved all the money that they're now trying to save with these cuts.
Can I endorse what Patrick is saying, having been involved in the criminal justice system at the sharp end for all these years, that these changes which have been brought in to privatise the prison services, the security systems dealing with prisoners at court and transporting them back to prisons, and the interpreter service have been absolute disasters. And this is the point, really, Patrick, is that we need to take ideology out of this. There is no inherent virtue in privatising services in the name of some sort of ideology that we need to get more private sector involvement in the administration of justice.
And they haven't been efficient.
They haven't been efficient. They have lost huge amounts of money. They have caused mayhem in courts with disruption as a result of interpreters not being properly qualified, or the prison services bringing prisoners to court late. All sorts of difficulties have arisen, and I'm afraid all of this is because if the government itself is obsessed with privatisation for the sake of privatisation. We need to take a sober view about this, where we can make efficiencies, as Patrick has said. Concrete proposals being pushed forward by solicitors and by barristers. The government say, hey, we can do this if we work together. We can cut the costs if we identify for you where the problems arise in the system, because we're working within the system and we know how it works on the ground. If the government's prepared to listen to that, yes, we can make progress. But if the government says, we're not really interested in all of that, we have a program and it's an ideologically driven one, and that is to cut public sector funding irrespective of whether it actually produces greater efficiencies or not, then we have a real problem. So, I
mean, the cuts aren't going to be made now till next year. So are these, efficient measures going to be introduced, making the system more efficient?
There will be cuts brought in. Part of the cuts have been suspended until next year. And Prerna, that's a classic example of how the solicitors and the barristers profession came together in unity in order to resist these cuts. And they've eventually persuaded this government to back down on a very important part of the cuts, which will now be deferred until the summer of next year. But that's not the end of it. It's only been deferred. It's not been cancelled. And so the fight and the campaign goes on. And those of us who work, for example, on the Society of Asian Lawyers will be continuing and renewing our enthusiasm to resist these cuts, because we know what's at stake, and the future of our administration of justice system is very much at peril, and we will continue to fight on this.
Patrick, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure having you. Unfortunately, we're coming to the end of the show.
Well, it's been always good to talk to you at Nusound Radio, and it's just great that you give airtime to these very, very important issues that affect so many people. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. Goodbye. So, Jo, the cuts are going to be implemented after the general election, so we do have time. The profession does have time to, adopt measures which can make it more efficient.
The professions, both solicitors and barristers, will continue to work hard to offer alternative ways of dealing with these cuts. And I would like to make a plea to those listeners out there, those who've had the reason to use legal aid and those who may have reason to use it in the future. Please contact your local MP and make sure that they understand how important this is to you.
Unfortunately, we've come to the end of the show. Thank you very much, Jo, for being with us. Tune in next week, where I'll be talking to Dr. Amjad Abu El-Ez on Israel and Palestine. It's going to be a very interesting show. Goodbye.